think the basic aspects of life that we all take for granted, and we really built service systems around the idea for many years that people with disabilities either lived in institutions or they lived in special buildings, or and they didn't work, and they didn't have families, they didn't have children, they weren't in mainstream schools. And obviously that's been changing over the years, but really, I think not changing as fast as many of us would like. And so we have some laws that we have been using in the disability community, primarily the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, to try to challenge some of those exclusions. There's also many other laws, IDEA and Section 504, the Fair Housing Act, which also come into play, the Constitution, of course, when it comes to government activities. But I think the ADA has become really, in so many ways, the primary vehicle for us to try to get people included and integrated into the mainstream of society. In the context of education, we call it inclusion. In pretty much every other context, I would say we call it community integration. And so, I think for the disability community as a whole, I would say that some of the bottom line issues are being educated, having kids with disabilities be educated in regular schools and regular classrooms with non-disabled peers, living in their own, adults with disabilities living in their own apartments, in their own homes, not in institutional settings like hospitals, nursing homes, boarding care homes, developmental disabilities institutions, and not in what we sometimes call special buildings for special people, these sort of segregated buildings specially designed for people with disabilities, but just regular settings like everybody else. There is a lot of work that we've been doing and that the Justice Department has now been doing along with the disability community, really to integrate people with disabilities in residential settings, so moving people out of institutions and into their own homes. And this is really, I think, this has been the foundation of community integration for people with disabilities, and sort of the baseline on which most of the other types of integration are happening or are building upon. So, you could say IDEA really in the educational setting is the foundation for including kids with disabilities in the classroom. We'll talk about this more later on, but increasingly folks are actually using the ADA for a variety of reasons to talk about including kids and providing kids with disabilities equal opportunity in school. So we began community integration work really under the ADA with what we call the integration mandate, and there was a Supreme Court decision called the Olmstead decision, which was about serving public entities that is state and local governments, having to serve people with disabilities in the most integrated setting appropriate. And so for the most part, that being in terms of where people live, usually in their own home or apartment. And as we developed the law really took a long time to develop on those issues. The ADA passed in 1990, and the president at the time, it was George H.W. Bush the first, actually said, the shameful walls of exclusion are going to come tumbling down now, and those were pretty strong walls, and so it's really taken a long time for the exclusion to really break down, and it's hard to change systems. It takes many, many years to do that, and I think some of the core applications of the ADA are the things that are the hardest to change. It's not so hard necessarily to do curb cuts on the sidewalks, but when you're talking about really changing service systems for people with disabilities that have operated on certain presumptions for many, many years, it's really hard to change the way things function. It's hard to change the way people think about people with disabilities. It's hard to change the way people do assessments of what their needs are, and just the premises on which, all of how we treat people with disabilities operates. So that change has taken a long time, and the law on community integration in terms of where people live took about, I would say, 15 or more years, 20 years really, to start developing in earnest. And so the ADA passed in 1990. The Supreme Court decided the Olmstead case in 1999, saying there was an integration mandate and people had the right to live in the most integrated setting. It was probably around 2010 that you really started having the law develop in a big way. The Justice Department started to get involved in that work and made it a priority. And so then after that, the disability community began to focus on what we think of as integration 2.0 and integration 3.0, or inclusion, which is integrated employment, getting people and getting disability service systems to help people with disabilities get real jobs and not be stuck in sheltered workshops or segregated day treatment settings, day treatment programs, which are basically, they often function kind of like babysitting, basically, during the day, and they're sort of dead-end programs that we used to stick people with disabilities in, and we still, to some extent, stick people with disabilities in, rather than assuming that, they can work and we can help folks find jobs. And, integration 3.0, which is inclusive education. And, it's very interesting to many of us that 60 years after Brown versus Board of Ed, there's really a remarkable amount of educational segregation of kids with disabilities. And so I think the Justice Department has now gotten interested in that, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But that's where folks are going now, and so I think you will see the law changing in the next bunch of years. But that's I would say how the notion of inclusion plays out in my work. And we litigate as well as doing policy advocacy in Congress and the administrative agencies, and we often bring lawsuits to challenge how states allocate resources in their service systems, and try to get states to allocate resources more toward community services and less towards institutional and segregated services. So in terms of crafting the ADA, have I missed people's questions? I saw there was some text on screen. I don't know if I missed any questions.
Okay, yeah, I see there are a couple of questions here. Let's see. Oh, I think it's more about just the logistics of Blackboard. The PowerPoint is being shown
okay.
on the screen. The professor
okay.
her screen. If you called in, you may not be able to see it. Okay. Yeah, I think my class, they're just helping each other out.
Okay.
About what's going on. So I think we're okay. This is a very lively class that is not very shy. So I think that
okay.
And let me just say again that Jennifer, she is brilliant and very important person, but she's also very down to earth. And you can, if you can't quite figure out the chat or you can't raise your hand and you want to just say, excuse me, you can interrupt her even in the middle and she'll be okay with it, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So let me move on to the other question you asked, which was about the amendments to the ADA. This is something that we worked on, in 2007, 2008. Actually, probably more than that, really, if you consider all the years that we in the disability community worked on trying to change the Americans with Disabilities Act. Is really about 10 years. It takes a long time sometimes to get Congress to do things. And there were some bad court decisions that essentially interpreted this civil rights law very, very narrowly, so that lots of folks who, we thought were covered under the ADA originally, courts said were not covered. People with diabetes, people with epilepsy, in many cases people with psychiatric disabilities, and all kinds of disabilities, courts were saying were not covered, and the Supreme Court said the law is really narrow. And so it took a long time, but there was a really massive movement, I guess, within the disability community to try to change things. And what we ended up doing really was an intensive effort starting around 2006 to get Congress to change the law to make it broader and to restore it to what we saw as Congress's original plan in enacting the ADA to cover a broad group of people. And so that took a lot of work because disability community is a very broad community, and it covers many different types of disabilities, and people have, in some ways, many of the same or common issues that they experience, but also, it looks very different in terms of the services people need, the kinds of accommodations people need, how particular language that you try to write to fix these problems, address how it plays out for people with different types of disabilities, is often very, very different. And so you have to consider that when you're doing a law that affects people with all kinds of different disabilities. So we had a small team of negotiators from the disability community that spent almost a year negotiating with a team from the business community, the Chamber of Commerce, and some of the large business associations. And it was not easy, and people walked away from the table a number of times, but ultimately were able to work something out. And during that entire process, we as the negotiating team were going back constantly to the disability community, to all parts of the disability community, to have big meetings and small meetings and to understand everybody's issues. And we spent lots of time, I think, really intensively trying to understand issues that came up for the deaf and hard of hearing community, issues that came up for the blind community, issues that came up for people with learning disabilities. And there were different types of problems that people had in the courts and different types of problems that people had with language that was being considered. So it really was pretty challenging to make sure that you got something that worked for everybody, and then that was also going to work for the business community. And so, it was a very hard process, but it succeeded. And I think, these days, the only way that you can usually get things through Congress is really to work with the other side. It's pretty hard to do things and ram them through if, you've got one side that's happy, one side that's unhappy. And so you really have to right now kind of, work together, and with a good partnership between the disability community and the business community to try to do that. But it was also a big partnership between, people who were leading these negotiations and people in all parts of the disability community that were really part of this. And so I see there are a couple of questions, and if we could go back to the first one, that'd be great. I don't know if Diane, you have it on your screen.
I do. So I think I think the first few were just about the technical piece, but I have one from Sarah that says, Jennifer, how does your team define disability in these situations to have a broader reach? And then I have from Laura Steele, what kind of pushback was Congress giving you on your revisions to the ADA?
Sure. So it's a good question about how you define disability to have a broader reach, and basically, without getting too technical about it, because there are a lot of technical things about it, the definition of the disability in the ADA had 3 parts to it, and the main part is if you have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits you in a major life activity. And the second part of it is if you have a history of such an impairment that substantially limited you in a major life activity at some point. And the third part of it is if you were regarded as or treated as having such an impairment. So there were a whole lot of problems that happened with those definitions, and I think the biggest problem was really the Supreme Court talking about how narrowly they were supposed to be read. And every court decision that came down saying a person wasn't covered by the law began with the reciting of the Supreme Court talking about how narrow this law was supposed to be and how restrictive a standard it was supposed to be. So, frankly, one of the changes that actually had the biggest impact was actually reversing that and saying, we intend the standard to be broadly interpreted or broadly construed to the maximum extent permitted by the terms of the law or something like that. So that was a piece of it. A piece of it was actually that the courts and the Supreme Court had said that you didn't consider the kind of what they call mitigating measures, like if you took medication or you had a prosthetic limb or you went to therapy or you did other kinds of measures to control the limitations that you had from a disability. The Supreme Court said, well, you know, when you look at people, you don't consider those things. So if you have insulin-dependent diabetes, you look at the person, you know, while they're taking their insulin. You don't, you don't consider them without their insulin. You have to consider those, or actually, I think I said it backwards before. You have to consider those mitigating measures, is what the Supreme Court said. That was not, I think, how Congress had intended it. And in fact, every single committee in Congress that had written about this question had said, thou shalt not consider mitigating measures in deciding whether someone has a disability. So in other words, if you had diabetes, the courts would look at you and say, well, you know, when you're taking your insulin, you're fine and you don't have any limitations. And so therefore, if somebody fires you and they say, you know, I'm firing you because of your diabetes, I don't like people with diabetes, that wouldn't be actionable. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't invoke the ADA because you wouldn't be covered. Because when you were taking your insulin, you were fine. If you had a psychiatric disability and you were taking medication for it and were in therapy for it, then, you know, and you were doing well when you were on your meds, then you were not considered a person with a disability. If you had epilepsy and you were taking anti-seizure medication and your seizures were controlled, then you could be discriminated against. Somebody could fire you, somebody could exclude you from school, somebody could discriminate against you in any number of other ways, and you wouldn't have any protection because the courts would say, well, when you're taking your anti-seizure medication, you're fine. And so we fixed that, and so Congress then said, no, you don't consider those mitigating measures when you figure out whether someone's covered by the law. So that was another piece, and you know, there were other pieces that were kind of technical, but those were, you know, some of the main things. Another one was basically that if people had substantial limitations, but they'd be intermittent. So with a psychiatric disability or with diabetes, they'd be, you know, it's not like you were substantially limited all the time at every moment of the day, or you walked around having seizures at every moment of the day. And so the courts would say, well, you know, gee, it's pretty significant limitation when it happens, but it doesn't happen that often. So, you know, you're not protected by the law. So Congress fixed that and said it doesn't matter. If it's intermittent, then you look at it while it's happening. So those were some of the types of changes that were made so that it broadened the definition of disability. And now I'm trying to remember the other question. Oh, what kind of pushback did we get from Congress? And actually, it was interesting. I think some of the more conservative folks in Congress were just concerned about, gee, this law is going to be too broad and it's going to, you know, impose then too many obligations on employers or on other entities that are covered by the law if too many people have rights under this law. And, you know, the business community actually pushed with us because we had come up with a deal, and I think they were worried that we would actually do better, you know, if they didn't negotiate with us, and if we didn't have a deal, that we would get a stronger law. But so when some folks in Congress pushed back and said, no, we don't want to do this, you know, they stood with us, and we all said this is part of the deal, and we did get that. Actually, what was ironic was that I think that in the outside world, I don't just think, I remember this, the biggest pushback actually came from the education community. It came from higher education institutions and to some extent K-12 schools, but I'd say more from higher education. And some of the things that were said were kind of interesting. One of the things that we also did to broaden the definition was we added some language into the statute that made clear that some of the disabilities, some of the types of impairments that courts had said weren't covered, that they were covered. And so it specifically, and some of the kind of major life activities were covered that were associated particularly with mental disabilities. So you know, it said in the revised law that thinking is a major life activity and learning is a major life activity and concentrating is a major life activity. And so there were a number of things like that. And the higher education institutions, I think, were concerned about having to make reasonable accommodations for, a broad group of folks. And so they actually, they were making arguments that actually thinking should not be a major life activity. And that actually caused a lot of consternation in Congress, because if America's higher education institutions were saying that thinking was not a major life activity, that was kind of distressing. So I think actually somebody stood up in Congress to say that, to read these comments that they had gotten from one of the institutions in their district, and then realized how absurd it sounded, and actually sat back down again and voted the other way. But that was actually an interesting thing. Is really the pushback, I think, came more from education than anything else, and not from the business community. What are the most common lawsuits that you encounter regarding violations of the ADA? That really, that's a good question, and I think really it depends on, the area you practice in. And so, because I practice in the area of mental health, I think I tend to see, certain types of violations, and frankly, the area you practice in is the thing you're going to get the most calls about. So because I focus on community integration and community mental health services, I would say certainly that is probably one of the most widespread violations that I see. Is there is no state that is affording people with mental illnesses the services that they need to succeed, on a systemic basis, and it's affording sufficient services. There are they're patchworks of good services, but there's not enough. And in every state, there's many more people who need those services than who can get them. And I just missed the question that was on the screen now. It was from Rebecca. Did the elementary and secondary education communities get involved in, and I can't see the rest of the question. Here it is. Now I have the chat on my screen and I can't see it. Did the elementary and secondary education communities get involved in this discussion? What was their response and contribution? So yeah, they did get involved in the discussion, and I think I talked about their response. They were unhappy, basically, that they were that there were too many people that were being covered. And if you mean sort of the rest of the community and not just the schools, but, families, advocates, not really. I think it was mainly the schools that were lobbying, that were going to Congress, that were, sort of had an organized effort through trade associations, getting the word out to, call Congress and say, basically, don't do this because we're worried this is going to blow up schools. It didn't blow up schools, as we can see, I think, but it did cover a broader group of people. The next question is also, given the broader definition of defining someone with a disability, how do you or Congress measure how much a disability will affect each individual? Do they resume to the medical term or social term in determining those factors? That's a good question. I think, it should be, and many of us really think about disability from more of a social model than a medical model, but frankly, I think the courts tend to look at it in a very medical way. You tend to have, frankly, people's treating professionals, whether they be doctors or social workers or, whatever type of treating professional is appropriate given the kind of impairment it is really usually that person and sometimes just a family member, or the person themselves certainly plays a significant part in describing the evidence. What happens to me, on a daily basis or on a weekly basis? What is my limitation? It's not so much about really labels and diagnoses, although frankly courts are always going to ask about your diagnosis, but really what the ADA is concerned about is really functional impairments. Do you have a functional impairment, physical or mental, that is causing limitations in some kind of important life activity? Okay, so I think we can move to the next question. And who initiated the movement to have the definition broadened? Would you say it was the teachers or actual disabled persons themselves? It was actually, I would say, advocates for people with disabilities, and particularly in the communities that were most affected by these decisions. So I would say the diabetes community and the epilepsy community. American Diabetes Association, the Epilepsy Foundation, and some of the broader advocacy groups, the American Association of People with Disabilities, really seeing the trend in these decisions and seeing sort of person after person told by the courts that they had no recourse, that maybe they were discriminated against, but they weren't even going to be able to show that the courts weren't even going to get to the merits of their claims. They were just going to say, sorry, you don't fall within the box of who Congress intended to cover. Those advocates really started a movement, and they started going to Congress, and they spent years talking to offices just try to get them to understand the problem. You passed this law, and look what's happening. It's not covering huge numbers of people that you intended to cover. So that's who really started the movement. Okay, in my experience, what do I see as some of the major barriers to greater inclusion of people with disabilities in our communities? I think sounds like somebody's on the subway or something. Okay, so
if anyone is, I see a few people are not muted. I don't know who you are because some of you called in, so I don't see a name. But if you're not muted, you might want to mute until you want to speak, because then we pick up like the background noise.
Yeah, and I think that person's muted now. So I would say probably, in my experience, the biggest barrier to inclusion really is attitudes. I mean, there's lots of mechanics that have to happen differently for inclusion, but I think, as I was saying a little bit before, there's so many parts of the process where you have to change people's thinking about people with disabilities and how capable they are. It's the expectation that people with disabilities would ordinarily be living in their own homes. Is that the default? There is the expectation that they should be living in a group home or in an institution of some kind. Is the expectation that kids with disabilities, that the default would be that they're virtually always in a regular classroom, or is the expectation that, it could be any range of things, and they could be in a segregated classroom, they could be in a mixed classroom, they could be in a segregated school? Is the expectation that people with disabilities will work at jobs like everybody else and get regular wages, or is the expectation that, lots of people with disabilities don't work, lots of people with disabilities will make sub minimum wages? And so really changing those expectations takes so much work, because there's so many people who really play a part in the mechanics of making systems change. People, doctors, nurses, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, school psychologists, teachers, and so it's really school administrators. There's so many people whose attitudes matter in terms of who makes the judgment calls about what happens, who makes the judgment calls about what services people need, what services kids need, what services adults need. And really, before you even look at the services, I think, just the premise of sort of what the default place should be, where you live, where you learn, where you work, really makes a big difference in terms of how you're even going to look at the constellation of services that you're going to offer somebody. So changing those attitudes, I think, often what's interesting for us is that we do this litigation, and we'll spend a number of years litigating against the state, and then we'll settle, and the state will agree to do a lot of things, and then it will become clear that they had no idea how to accomplish what they've agreed to, and they had no idea how difficult it was going to be to change their service systems, because they have to persuade so many people. And really, I think change comes from the top. You have to have leadership that are really conveying a very strong message if we're going to do things differently in order to get things to change. And even then, it's a hard thing to do. It's not impossible, and we've seen a lot of service system change. That's really, really helpful, and I think this is true in schools as well. But attitudes, I would say, are really, I think, the hardest thing to overcome, harder than anything else. what can an idealistic teacher do in the face of negativity towards inclusion? I think that's a really good question. And I guess related to the question that I see actually in the chat box of what are some ways that teachers can help improve the graduation rate for persons with disabilities. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that, one of the things that is really important is, having tenacity, having creativity, and, I'm obviously not going to get into sort of all the details of, what works for a particular kid, but really, I think showing that it's always, just like it's the adults, it's the kids, the people never expected to succeed in an inclusive classroom, for an adult in, say, a workplace or in their own homes. It's those people that change attitudes. It's those people that change systems. It's always the kid that everybody thought could never be in a regular classroom, and that goes into a regular classroom and gets services he or she needs and thrives. Those are the things that need to happen for service systems to change. And I think, people's commitment to have those examples and to really make a big deal of them, I think makes a huge difference in terms of getting others to follow along. You have to have the examples. And Diane did that with her own child, and it was dramatic. It was dramatic how, a school changed because of Diane's kid. It was dramatic how, Diane wrote a book, and, all of a sudden all of these advocates and school systems are sort of interested in the story, and it really, those things change minds. Stories really do make a huge difference in terms of, bringing change in a systemic way. And so I think that's probably one of the most important things. And in terms of, specific kids, obviously it's sort of really coming from the attitude of, what works for this kid, instead of coming from the place of, why is this kid, how can I get this kid out of my hair? This kid's a problem, and, what do I have to do, instead of, how can we help this kid, and, what are the triggers? What are the particular things that help? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about, not a lot, but a little bit about our notion of school-based behavior services, I think a little bit later at the end. And somebody else has written, changes in attitudes is something very important in having inclusion and accessibility. How can this be accomplished in a school that is new to the idea of inclusion, or even in the community? And yeah, I think that actually, may have already answered that. I think you have to have the beginning examples. You can't kind of go to a school that's never done it before, just like a service system that's never done it before, and kind of expect dramatic change tomorrow and expect them to change the way that they do things on a systemic basis. I mean, you have to start slowly. You have to start with, a few kids. You have to start with examples of, again, examples that really have the power to change people's minds, because they bust people's attitudes about, what the capabilities are of kids with disabilities. I think it all comes down to, people's attitudes about how capable kids are of learning. Let me see. The next set of questions I have, the implications of the ADA. Recently, the ADA has been used instead of the IDEA to argue for a more inclusive placement in a school setting. Can you tell us more about the differences between the IDEA and the ADA? So this is really interesting. I think people always think about the IDEA as the main law for kids with disabilities in schools to get what they need. And, to some extent, I think that's true, because the IDEA gives you a lot of very specific process and very specific rights related to kids with disabilities in schools. The ADA is sort of harder to use on an individual basis, and it's more general. It's not specific to any particular kind of setting like schools. And it's more vague in a way. But the ADA actually has some, I think, really strong substantive standards that are actually better than the IDEA. So in some ways, sometimes we think of the IDEA as more about process, even though it may help people on a daily basis more than the ADA. ultimately, in terms of changing the way schools operate, I think it's going to be the ADA rather than the IDEA that really makes the biggest change. So IDEA, has process required, like due process hearings, like, IEPs and functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans and all these very, very specific kinds of process things. And so there's something that you can make a school do in order to help a kid with a disability. But in terms of the substantive standards of ultimately what the goal is of all of this process of, of your IEP and of the behavior plan and of the intervention plan, sort of what is the goal of all of that? Really, the Supreme Court said for the IDEA, and this was actually in the A's, it was in a case called Rowley, that kids weren't entitled to maximize their potential in school. Kids were not entitled to equal opportunity under IDEA. That didn't require that. That what it required was basically some educational benefit. And the courts have been a little bit all over the place, and some courts have interpreted that in a strong way. Some courts have interpreted that in a weaker way. Frankly, I think courts are often driven by the facts in front of them and how strong they are and how motivated they are to want to do something. But it's not a great standard. Some educational benefit. If you thought about, what you wanted for your kid, would you say some educational benefit? No, you'd say something more. The ADA, very clearly on its face, is all about equal opportunity and the same opportunities to do things as people without disabilities, including the same opportunities to learn, the same opportunities to benefit, get equally effective services. And so I think that's really turning out to be a stronger standard in many ways than IDEA. IDEA requires that you serve kids in the least restrictive environment, yet you still have all these kids in segregated school settings, in part because, well, if you're not entitled to equal opportunity and you're not entitled to sort of all the services you need to achieve that in a regular school, then, courts are going to find that the least restrictive environment is often a segregated setting because the services haven't been provided. And I think the services that a lot of kids with really significant behavior issues need are just not found on a regular basis across the country. They're found, again, like other services, in pockets, in patchworks, in particular school systems that have a commitment to inclusion, but it's not the norm. And it's changing. I think there's a different dialogue that's happening now, but we're a far cry from being in a place where we're providing kids all the services they need to succeed in a regular school across the country. I'm getting a question, what are some strategies, ideas that you can suggest for teachers to provide the optimum equal opportunity in an inclusive classroom? So, so I actually am happy to send some materials too, which I think will be helpful because I didn't want to get into a huge amount of detail, but we've been litigating in this area, and actually the Justice Department has been litigating in this area. I think there is going to be a lot of change. It's pretty interesting what's been happening. We have actually tried to boil down the concepts of sort of what the services have to be that work for every kid. And obviously, this is on a 10,000-foot level because what works for any particular kid is going to look different, but, what has to happen on a 10,000-foot level for every kid. We call it school-based behavior services and have boiled down to basically 4 things: a comprehensive assessment that includes looking at identifying the triggers for behaviors. Second, a school-based intervention plan that relies on positive support, social skills training, a care coordinator, and that's a piece that's often missing, is someone that's coordinating between outside, inside school services, and adjustments in curriculum and schedule and academic stuff. Third is training for school staff as well as parents to implement the plan that's developed, and fourth is coordination with non-school providers involved with the child. So all kinds of outside mental health providers and other providers. So that's basically how we've tried to define school-based behavior services, and really I think it does come down to kind of having a can-do attitude, being creative, what works for this kid. If pulling this kid out for a few minutes at a time. It's having a kid have a mentor, somebody that checks in with the kid, at different times of day. And there's so many things that I'm sure you've all used to promote inclusion. But it's really focused on sort of what works for any particular kid. Somebody's written in the community school where I currently do my field work, special ed students are placed in the same classroom instead of dispersing them into their respective grade general education classroom. This seems to violate nowadays national policy, tries to promote community integration, and that's exactly right. It tries to promote inclusion. And so I think you are going to see some change in this. We have a case in Massachusetts that is actually, I think, the first of its kind that focuses on using the ADA to challenge the segregation of kids. These are kids with mental health disabilities in Springfield, Massachusetts, and there is a public school, both that has an elementary, a middle school, and a secondary school. They're all segregated. They're all for kids with mental health disabilities, and about a third of the kids that have emotional disturbance label in this school system are all sent to this school. And it's basically a kind of dead-end school. It's like a prison environment. The city has a contract with the police that are in there all the time, and there's not sort of a whole lot of therapeutic stuff that happens there. There's a lot of punitive things, and kids getting thrown against the desk or the wall and taught a lesson, and so not a lot of learning and different curriculum that is available to these kids, and they don't get the opportunities to participate in extracurricular activities in the same way in sports, etc. And frankly, just all the parents want their kids out of the school because they think once they get in, they realize it's not a great place to be, and kids aren't learning, and kids are basically seen as they're sort of throwaway kids. And so that case was allowed to go forward. There's a preliminary ruling from a judge basically saying, yes, you can use the ADA in this way to challenge segregated education. These kids are not getting, or at least the allegations are, these kids are not getting equal opportunity because they're not getting the services that they need to succeed in their neighborhood schools. And since then, the Justice Department has been in this area as well, and so they last year actually issued a findings letter finding that Georgia was violating the Americans with Disabilities Act because it was sending kids through a network of schools, kids with behavior disabilities. We're all going to a network of segregated schools just for kids with behavior disabilities called GNETS, G-N-E-T-S. I forget what that stands for, but this is very much a state-based system. But it's interesting because the kids with disabilities are actually being segregated in the old segregated schools that would literally the buildings that were used in the days of de jure segregation by race. These are in the schools that African American kids were educated in that were basically inferior segregated schools, before Brown versus Board of Education, and now the same buildings are being used to house these and serve these kids with behavior disabilities. So I have a new question. In one of my semesters of field work, I had a classroom where there were over 50% of the students identifying with some learning disability or IEP. Is this illegal in this illegal situation? And with the special ed director always out of the classroom, what can the general education teacher do if administrations in the school is not responding to this abuse? That's a good question, and I think it's a hard one. And I'm not sure there's an easy answer. It's not like you can sort of fix everything yourself, but I think really being connected to both the families and really the advocacy community. There is a network of what are called protection and advocacy systems for people with disabilities. They are in every state. They're federally required because every state gets money to have this kind of service system, or it's more of a legal service system for people with disabilities to protect and advocate for their rights. This has been around since the 70s, and actually it's changed over the years. It began really as a system to address institutional abuse and neglect, And Diane has a note also about Advocates for Children in New York City, which is very, very involved in these issues. Diane's note says they're in Midtown and currently have many class action suits against the New York City Department of Education. And the PNA now in New York is called Disability Rights New York, and they have offices in various parts of the state. They have an office in Brooklyn. And Advocates for Children also has free legal counseling to those in need, including support to teachers who want to be anonymous. So that's a helpful resource. Do you think it's better for kids with special needs to go to a transfer school? I observed at a transfer school last semester, and a lot of the kids were identified as special ed. It's a really welcoming community, but with some great examples of co-teaching, but it seems similar to the issue that the other person had just posed. I think it's great because it offers kids a way to graduate with a high school diploma, but it might be a form of discrimination as well. I think it's better for kids with special needs to go to a transfer school if they're better able to provide kids with services that might help them, for example, co-teaching. And yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and I think this is something that people always struggle with. Sort of, there are environments that are better for kids often because there's more folks that understand, how to address the needs of kids with disabilities. Is that the ultimate environment you want? Not if it's segregated. No, I mean, there's a lot of data that I think, inclusive education settings just produce much better outcomes for both kids with disabilities and for kids without disabilities. It's either better or neutral. And so, but people have to deal with practical realities, and sometimes, that an environment which is, not fully integrated may be the best option for somebody, for a while, but it's not what we should be ultimately advocating for. And, I think you have to basically set your sights on what you ultimately want, and, not just something that's better than something else.
I just tried to copy and paste a comment from a while ago from 528 that I think got kind of lost because then a bunch of comments came in, but I didn't get it the right way. But it's a good question. Could you talk a bit about what the current state is of assessment accommodations afforded under ADA? And do you find that most parents are aware of their children's rights here? I'd imagine it varies around the country to a great degree. And I think this ties in with the recent questions about what to do when you see that, you're in a school that's really not handling things the right way. Because the reality is a lot of times parents are not aware of their children's rights. But I'll let
you. That's right. That's right, exactly. And I mean, I think, the accommodations are really, I think, a whole broad range. There is no limit on, what types of accommodations are required under the ADA, except that they have to be reasonable. And what that means is basically, usually they can't cost a huge amount, but, frankly, it's not, there isn't a lot of law on this. Nobody really knows. It's generally going to be, if it costs $1 zillion, it's not going to be reasonable. Most accommodations in school that kids need are going to be reasonable in cost. And, if it required the school to do some outlandish thing that is, never done, if if the accommodation was, you have to, have the teacher take the kid to the zoo every day. Obviously, that's not going to work, and it's going to not allow the teacher to teach. But, for most kinds of accommodations, it's really if the kid needs it, and it's reasonable, it's generally reasonable, then, it should be provided. I think, frankly, most kids don't have really somebody looking at kind of, what it is in a creative way, what it is, what are the kinds of things that work for this particular kid? What are the triggers for behaviors? What kinds of things stop those behaviors or prevent them? So, really people should ask for whatever they need. There's not, the ADA is really, hasn't been used that much in the education setting. And so, there's not a lot of answers yet, but frankly, until there are, I'd say anything goes. If it seems reasonable, then people should ask for it. Are transition services mandated under both IDEA and ADA? What is your view of the efficacy of these services, particularly the development of objectives related to employment and other post-school areas? Secondary schools seem primarily geared exclusively toward college readiness. Yeah, I think that's true. I actually, this is an area that I haven't focused on that much, but I think, you know, transition services are a huge issue, and they haven't generally been provided in a great way that gets kids ready for work. And frankly, I think part of the thing is that they don't start early enough, and there really isn't a lot of planning, and parents and families aren't really brought in. There's not a serious exploration of what kids want and what kids want to do with their lives. And so really, you know, it's sort of a frantic push at the end to say, you know, gee, what are we going to do with this kid, instead of, you know, what does this kid want, and, you know, what's a good goal for this kid. So, and I would say in terms of ADA and IDEA, I mean, yes, IDEA has some very specific requirements about it. ADA doesn't. ADA is a very general non-discrimination law, but I do think that, you know, transition services fall under the rubric of equal opportunity. I mean, kids with disabilities should have equal opportunity, kids without disabilities, and part of what schools do is help kids transition. And so I think there's an ADA issue there as well, and I would say, you know, whatever is required under IDEA is going to be required under ADA, and probably more is going to be required under ADA. It's just that if you say ADA to people in schools, they probably look at you funny and say, but the ADA doesn't apply, it's the IDEA. And I think, you know, actually, you know, changing the conversation to start folks focusing on the ADA is an important thing. And actually, I'm happy to send around just some of the materials that are recent on some of these ADA cases and some of what the Justice Department has said, particularly about the ADA's application to education. And from Rebecca Cohen, we have attitudes are the biggest change to be made, should include inclusion classrooms aim to turn non-disabled students into advocates for their peers. Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's
and I think,
I'm sorry. That's a really interesting question, because that's been one of the most fascinating things, I think, of our journey, of my journey as a parent and also as a teacher. You really don't have to do a lot of work for this to happen. This is just what happens. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why inclusion is so powerful. And it happens with 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, and it happens with middle schoolers. It's something, it's part of that, like the natural order. You know, as long as you have a teacher who's, you know, accepting and setting a good tone for, you know, creating a positive environment for everybody. This is just what the kids do. And that's why it works so well. You know, there's not, the students are the best models and the best teachers for their peers, I think.
Yep, that's right. And just one other thing actually about the transition services, the other thing to keep in mind is that, you know, for a lot of kids who get services, and I don't know how much these kids are in your classrooms, but, you know, kids on Medicaid, things look very different for them suddenly when they age out of the kids' Medicaid system, and when they turn 22, suddenly they become ineligible for all these services that they've been getting. And, you know, part of transition services, I think, is sort of planning for that. And I know that doesn't happen very well in most places, and kids sort of get dumped out into the adult system, and really people haven't thought about it until the very last minute. And so that's another piece of transition services, may or may not be that relevant to you all. Okay, the last question, I think, is where are we as a nation with regard to securing equal rights for those with disabilities? How does this journey compare with the journey the LGBT community is on? And that's a very interesting question. And I would say somebody made a remark about this at a disability rights legal conference several years ago that I just thought was right on the mark. It was somebody, it was a civil rights lawyer from the LGBT community, who basically said, you know, how I would encapsulate things is that people with disabilities got legal rights early on, but not social acceptance. And for the LGBT community, they've never been able to get the legal rights, but they've made a lot of progress on social acceptance over the past, say, 10, 15 years. And so they've had this dramatic shift. And I would say now that's changed even more. They have made a lot of strides in gaining legal rights with some of the decisions coming out of the Supreme Court, and particularly the marriage decisions, because I think really the key in all of these discrimination issues is seeing people as other. And the key to all of these bad court decisions that happened over all these years involving discrimination against people in the LGBT community were kind of based on this notion that, they're other, they're different, they don't have families, they don't get married, they don't, and really, I think that's why marriage became such an important goal in the community, because it's not just about people wanting to get married, it's really sort of about everything else. It's about the way that people see folks. And, really, I think was an important landmark in sort of shifting attitudes about the LGBT community. With people with disabilities, I think there's very much still a sense of other, and it's very challenging to get over that. And I think that it's interesting that the ADA happened in 1990, and that was, in some ways early. It happened later than many of the other civil rights laws, but and actually the Rehabilitation Act happened earlier than that. It happened in 1973, which had a little throwaway line about people that got federal funding not discriminating against people with disabilities, and that became a very big deal. It wasn't something Congress thought about a lot when it enacted it, but so disability rights really have been around largely, I guess, in a federal way since probably the 70s. I mean, there were a couple of other laws before that, the Architectural Barriers Act in the 1960s, but really the ADA was a landmark, and that was a huge shift in disability rights and really, I think, changed the landscape. But it is remarkable that social attitudes have taken so long to shift, and we still have so far to go. And so I'm not sure there's kind of a clear answer in terms of sort of where we are, who's ahead, the disability community or the LGBT community, because both have made certain advances and not others. But it's been interesting to kind of see those differences. And I do think that it was a good observation that people with disabilities got legal rights early on, but despite those laws, many things haven't changed because of persistent attitudes. Looking at these chat questions, I'm curious about the criteria for evaluating the performance of special ed students in the New York State test, since they are currently required to do so, just like ELLS, but we know the same regular class standards are imposed to ELLs, which cause a lot of concerns to teachers. So there are actually specific tests tailored to the SPED students to facilitate their performance. That I don't know. That's not I think that there's not like a national or uniform kind of test or anything. Is there sort of specific tests that, Diane, I think maybe can speak more to that than I can.
I think in the recent years, certainly with the shift to Common Core, the special ed students are expected in almost every instance the test that everybody else takes. And while on the one hand, it seems like it might be more difficult for them, what it does is it raises the bar on what they have to learn. So in some way it's a good thing. It also is, I like Tracy's response, which I think is right on, that it's more about can they get an accommodation? Can they get extended time? Is extended time within one day appropriate? I know some students with serious disabilities get an accommodation to take in New York State Regents over 2 days, because to take a test for 6 hours is just too much. So I think the downside is it's very hard to get a Regents diploma in New York State. So there are special ed students, at the end of their high school years whose families relocate to New Jersey or send them to school in New Jersey or Connecticut, where they don't have to pass the same kinds of tests. So that's an issue. Can we give them a high school diploma that's usable and hold them to slightly lower standards? That's something that's going on, that a lot of people are negotiating for right now, because right now there's a IEP diploma, but it's basically useless. You can't go to community college, and you can't join the armed services. You can't take a civil service test. So, but on the other hand, I think by holding them to the same standard, we force the teachers to teach them instead of giving them a completely watered down curriculum. So
and I think related to that, there's the most recent amendments to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that just passed. This was a big issue about sort of giving kids with disabilities alternate testing, and there's a big fight about that issue. And I think the current standard is that something like 1% of kids with disabilities can get alternate testing, and that's it. And there was a big effort in Congress to try to raise that percentage, and the disability community fought very hard against that and to keep it down to 1% because of the idea that, the idea is holding kids to the same standards. And, the biggest problem we have, I think this related to attitudes, is just low expectations. That, these kids won't do as well, they can't do as well, and we don't expect them to do as well. And frankly, when you have different expectation, then, kids can meet it. But when you expect people to fail, then, you treat them that way, and, basically you shouldn't be surprised at the results you get then. So anyway, that's I think actually critical issue.
There's a very nice question from Laura, which might be a nice ending question, as I see we're getting towards 6 o'clock, which, I think is when we'll probably wrap up. But Laura asks, do you have an example of a case that stands out in your mind as one that you're particularly proud of or find particularly inspiring?
So I guess I would say maybe a case that we actually did in New York. We went to trial, and it was a community integration case, and it was about people with mental illnesses living in what they call adult homes in New York, which are these large warehouses. Essentially, they're 200, 300, 400 beds in many cases, and this was considered, quote unquote, the community. They developed really in the 1970s and 80s as people were leaving state psychiatric hospitals and the state was downsizing its hospitals. Instead of creating real community opportunities with people living in their own homes in small settings, they essentially didn't know what to do with folks, and they dumped people into these places, which were often rehabbed hotels or sort of just large buildings that served other purposes. And they would serve hundreds of people with mental illness to basically sort of dead-end places. People sit around and smoke and sometimes go to current events classes and, don't do a lot. They, don't really, again, sort of low expectations. Nobody would help you to try to find a job. Nobody would expect you to work. Nobody really gives you meaningful services, and people just basically sit around and do nothing all day and have to be in the facility basically all the time because there are meals, and essentially your Social Security or SSI check is going towards those meals. And so, you have to be there 3 times a day for meals. You get often assigned seats. You get assigned roommates. You don't have a lot of choice in much of anything about your day. It's all kind of programmed. These are really just, they're entirely people with mental illnesses, 98 or 100% people with mental illnesses in most cases. They're all in New York City. And I should say, actually, people are there not only for meals, but meds, and you have to sort of wait on long lines to get meds dispensed at various times of day. And so people just basically spend all their days there. And so people had no opportunity when they were in these places to get out to move to their own homes with supports. New York has something called supported housing, where people live in their own apartments and they get flexible services that are tailored to their needs, and it's actually basically a little less expensive than serving people in these crummy dead-end settings that are essentially warehouses. And so we went to trial and we won using the ADA to challenge New York's use of these places. They were privately operated, and when you create for-profit industries that thrive on providing services to people with disabilities, sometimes you create new sets of stakeholders that have interests in keeping institutions open and keeping people in them. And so this was, I think, a pretty big deal, and it set a lot of precedents. And then it got overturned on a technical issue, and after that, the Justice Department came in and joined us, and we said, we're going to bring a class action basically to do the same thing. And they ultimately settled with us, and the settlement essentially provides most of the relief that we had gotten after the trial. And so right now we're in the implementation of that settlement, and it is giving people, thousands of people in these places, an opportunity for the first time to actually have a life and to live in their own home, live in their own apartment, to have some control over their life and their day, and have basically meaningful services, and be able to exercise choice and autonomy. So that's, I would say, probably the case I'm most proud of.
Well, thank you. So, we're going to start wrapping up. We have 2 more questions. Jolie asked about strategies you recommend for first-time teachers who have students with disabilities. How can we make those students feel as comfortable as those who are without disabilities? And then I guess Tracy's responding to the story you just told. That sounds terrible. I remember in one of the articles we read a few class sessions ago, people with disabilities feel more meaningful when they feel as if they're part of a community. In the article, many of the people were doctors, lawyers, basically successful people with identified disabilities. So, I think they almost kind of tie in with each other, don't they?
Right, but I think you, Diane, should answer Jolie's question because you're perfectly suited to do that.
I think you just have to be open, and you have to be excited to see what they're going to bring into your classroom. I think that's the main thing, is just to have a positive attitude. Try not to put too much stock in the IEP, which you probably will read before you meet them, but know that that's just, a very limited cross-section of who they are, and just, make a connection with the student like you would with any other student. And I think when the teacher is open and sets the tone, then all the other students follow suit. And just know, make a commitment to yourself that you're going to make it work. And, just be looking for ways you can use the supports that they have, the ways you might be able to bring in some more supports for them. And, I think just be excited about it. I know, like, a lot of times there are a lot of teachers and even administrators in school, I've shared some stories with you, who are rather negative, and, they'll scare you about particular students. And I think you just have to, dismiss that, and you have to just be excited, because the truth is the kids with disabilities are they're really the most interesting ones. I mean, they're the ones who make teaching interesting and exciting, and who turn things upside down, and just, try and make your classroom a place where they can shine. And I hope that, as we go through this course, certainly co-teaching is one technique, being comfortable with another person in your room. And we're about to start 4 evenings talking about differentiated instruction. So, all of those will also give you techniques that, will make you more comfortable broadening your classroom. So let's see, one more. I think also opening the classroom to the issues of disabilities and having awareness is very important. Also teaching them how to respond appropriately to their classmates with disabilities and viewing them as the same as everyone rather than casting them out. Absolutely. So just, moving more toward viewing disability as diversity and not as something negative, I think helps. And I think, as Jennifer mentioned before, as soon as you see the first success, as soon as you have the first good 10 minutes with a student who's been a challenge to someone else's classroom, like, that just builds on it. Because if you can have a good 10 minutes, you can have a good 20 minutes, and you can have a good day, So I want to thank Jennifer for being with us. We have a hand raise, our first hand raise. Go ahead.
Since we were talking about first-time teachers, I was just wondering, is there something that a first-time teacher need to be vigilant about in terms of like my right as a teacher when I'm dealing with students in a diverse classroom that have IEPs?
I mean, you need to know the IEP and you need to respect it. You need to follow through with whatever accommodations and supports, like you're legally bound to that. That being said, a lot of times schools make it impossible to follow the IEP because they don't provide the right amount of service providers or the right teacher-student ratio. But that's, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at, but that legally, you need to know what's on the IEP and what that student, if that student gets extended time, you need to provide extended time on tests. If the students get directions clarified or directions reread, there's all kinds of different accommodations students might have surrounding testing. You certainly need to know it and you need to find a way to make it happen. You know, those are kind of the technical pieces. And then, you know, the rest I think are things we've already touched on, just, you know, being positive and being open and starting some kind of communication with their parents or their guardians, being in touch with the school service providers, and just keeping the lines of communication open. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, and Ashley.
I just wanted to know, so since you just mentioned that like a lot of schools don't provide the proper resources for teachers to follow the IEP, so if we were ever in a position where we had an IEP and our school wasn't meeting our needs, could we go above the school to help our student, or do we just that's it?
That's a really sticky question. I mean, it kind of comes down to a question that was asked before. You know, you have to be careful doing that. I think it's better if the parent does it because the parent is not going to be fired. Certainly if you don't have tenure. I mean, of course, in an ideal world, yes, you should go above. I know you can certainly reach out to Advocates for Children and those other, you know, I'll leave you by the end of the year with a list of places you can reach out to and you can do it anonymously, or, you know, at least get support. But the best thing is to help the parent become a better advocate. And some of that has to be, you know, and you're going to hear the staff from the school out here is going to come in a few weeks. And I remember last semester, the principal told my class that, you know, he has a very open relationship with parents, but he has them, when he emails them, he has them, when it's about a kid with an IEP or supports that they may want to ask for, he doesn't even use his school email. He has them use his personal email. Like you have to give messages to the parent about what they need to ask for and what they need to fight for. But then unfortunately, you know, sometimes you have to do it anonymously because administrators and teachers are under huge pressure not to make more referrals. We have that same situation in our school right now. I have a girl in my class who is doing very nicely in 6th grade, but she absolutely, definitely needs to be classified and needs her IEP. And the school-based support team has come to me and said, we need to declassify her because we can't recommend so many students for services. And I'm not even sure what exactly that means. I mean, I don't think they're able to be given a quote on how many students can get support, but they're really pushing the parents. So when the parents came in for parent conferences, I said, look, I know what's going on and I really shouldn't be saying this, but I think she's doing beautifully, but I know what's coming next year in 7th grade. I have a child with an IEP and you know, I know she's doing beautifully, but you need to fight as hard as you can to keep the services that she has, but please don't say that I said that. You know, unfortunately, that's, you know, if you want to protect yourself, you need to handle it that way. But if you can get the parents in a position to fight, that's great. Not all parents can. That's the problem. Some parents in the city or anywhere are just not equipped for various reasons to advocate successfully. But there are, through Advocates for Children, I know many people who you can get free advocacy. You can even get an advocate to come with you to meetings. So if you can just, you know, get a parent to make a phone call, even if they don't speak the language, they have operators that speak different languages. If you can get those phone numbers in their hand, they could probably get some help.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions before we part? Okay, so I really want to thank Jennifer again. I love hearing from you because you have so much to say and it's so interesting to hear about inclusion and the ADA on a broader scale than sometimes we look at in education.
So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Okay, so as far as my class goes, so this is it. Isn't this a nice, easy online night? No responses. No, I know your paper tonight, so the link is set up, but this was great. Thank you for your lively questions. I told Jennifer this was a nice lively bunch, so I'm excited to see you. I think April 5th. Is it April 5th? We meet again in person, and thank you. You're doing a lot of great work, and I'm looking forward to reading your projects. I did record it, so I think we had a full house, but I'll try and get a link up, within the next week, in case you want to go back and revisit it. Oh, we have a lot of thank yous. Let's just see. Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. This was extremely helpful. This was great. It's pretty cool. Thank you, Jennifer. You're cool. Thank you so much for your insight. Okay, so thank you so much. Have a great night. Thank you. It was very informative and allows us to think beyond what a textbook can tell us. That's well said. Okay, thank you so much. So keep emailing with questions. And if you have any questions for Jennifer, she's always open to answering things even after the class. I can forward her an email. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Good night.